Hi guys, it's Angela here. Thank you for joining me on this video. On this video today, I want to talk about three doctrines or three areas of the Jehovah's Witnesses belief that just didn't sit well with me when I was a practicing Jehovah's Witness for over 20 years and served as a full-time pioneer straight out of school. Now, there's lots of things that didn't sit well with me, but I'm just going to talk about the top three today. Now, the first area that I always questioned was in regards to God speaking only through the slave class, and now they've changed their doctrines on that, and I'm led to believe that now they say Jehovah only speaks through the governing body. And I always had a problem with this, and this is why. When I was at school, there were a number of girls in my class that were Christians, and they went to their various churches, and they were all very fervent in their beliefs. And the one thing that they always shared in school was that they were filled with Holy Spirit, and when they went to church, God would speak through them, and God was doing all these miraculous things in their life. And even as young girls, I went to an all-girls school, even from the age of 11 till 16 when I left. This was very evident, and girls used to talk about things like that in school, that they'd been to church and church was amazing, and people got into the spirit, and that they're blessed, and that was their language. And I always felt that as a Jehovah's Witness, my language was always very censored, always very uninspired, because as Jehovah's Witnesses, everything's monitored. There's no room for personal expression, no room for exuberance, and getting excited about things, and even just as part of our everyday language as Jehovah's Witness, you're indoctrinated. So to say things like, oh, I'm filled with Holy Spirit, or I'm truly blessed, and and all of this stuff that people in other churches would talk about, that never happened, and that was just not part of the language for Jehovah's Witnesses or for myself. So as I was growing up, I used to question that, and I had to be careful. And if you're Jehovah's Witness, you know that you have to be careful what you say and who you say it to. But I used to always question that for all the millions and billions of people on the earth, are we to truly believe that God, in his absolute magnificence and his glory, chooses to select a group of imperfect old men in New York to speak through? And it never sat well with me that God would just choose to only speak with these people. So my questioning, and what really started me thinking about this, was I used to think, well, if we have the anointed class, and we were taught that there's this group of select people, 144,000, who are going to go to heaven and rule as kings and princes along with Jesus in heaven over the earthly class. If these people are so special special, if they are anointed, then why would God not want to speak through them too? And I remember saying to someone, I said, they were just a member, they were publishing the congregation that I was close to, and I had to be really careful who I spoke to, but I was really questioning, well, and what really led me on this path to questioning it, because we had one of the so-called anointed in our congregation, and she was a lovely elderly lady, and I used to sit and I used to look at her, and I used to think to myself, wow, you've grown up with this belief all your life, and you really fervently believe this, and the only time we never saw that sister at the hall for the meetings was if she was ill. And every meeting she sat there, second row from the front, on the end, meeting in, meeting out. And the only time I heard this sister answer, she didn't put her hand up and answer very often, but the only time I remember her answering a question was one eve. It wasn't a Sunday meeting, it was the one of the week meetings in the week, and she put her hand up and she said that she looked forward to receiving the Watchtower and Awake magazines, because to her it was like receiving a personal letter from Jehovah. And that, for some reason, that has always stuck in my mind. And I remember thinking, at this time, I'd left school and I was a pioneer. So I must have been like, 16, 18, something like that. And I remember thinking to myself, that's interesting. If you see the magazines as being a personal letter to you from Jehovah, how do you communicate with God? If you are one of the anointed, this heavenly class who's going to rule in heaven, how do you communicate with God, and how does God communicate with you? And it started me thinking, because as I say, people would be saying, out in the world, people I went to school with would say that, God would speak to them and God would give them these messages, and God would help them. God, gave a blessing in their life. God had done this. He'd worked a miracle in their life. He'd done all of this. And they would pray, and, they had this communication with God. But that was never ever mentioned as a Jehovah's Witness. So, I really started to think, well, surely God would be communicating to you. And I remember saying to my mother once, and at this point I was on the edge of leaving, and I remember saying to her that I don't believe that God only speaks through these old men. I'm trying not to be rude here, but I can't believe that God would only choose to speak through these old men. And I said, and in fact, how does God speak to them? And the response was, well, through prayer and dedication and reading the Bible, they get insight. And I was like, well, that's not good enough. So in that respect, how does God communicate with these old men in New York, self-appointed old men? And if you are of the 144,000 class who's going to heaven, how does God communicate with you? So that was always something that really bothered me. So that was something that really I had to really question, was how does God communicate? And when I left the Jehovah's Witnesses, then I could see out in the world that people would, just everyday, ordinary people would be talking about God, speaking to them. They would hear from God, and they had this two-way communication, but that was never something with Jehovah's Witnesses. So that really was something that I questioned. And after I escaped the Jehovah's Witnesses, really came to wake up and realize that God doesn't speak to this governing body. God doesn't speak to this anointed class. In fact, God doesn't speak to them at all, because they are completely self-appointed, completely deluded, making up their own stuff, and that is for sure. And as regards the whole question of God, I believe that there is a much higher power than all of us, and I don't believe follow any religion or any faith or anything like that, but I do believe that there is a much higher power, and this higher power is so almighty, it doesn't get concerned with tiny little everyday human things, such as the minute details that Jehovah's Witnesses go into. The second thing that I always had to question with Jehovah's Witnesses was about the sacredness of life. And the reason this always sat uneasy with me is because when I was about 14 or 15, going along to the meetings, there was a young lady in my congregation, and unfortunately, very sadly, she got raped. And because her family were Jehovah's Witnesses, they went to the elders, and the elders gave them the whole spiel about, life and its sacredness, and we have a responsibility to preserve life, etc., etc., all of that. And it said, you're not allowed to have an abortion. And this young lady was in absolute turmoil, because one, not only was she pregnant as a young woman, she'd be about 16, 17. Her life was beginning, and now she was pregnant with a child that she just didn't want. But secondly, she became pregnant through a horrific attack and rape. And she would have to live with that consequence. And she had to live with the trauma of going through a rape, never mind having to carry a baby, give birth to this child, and then the consequences of what happens after, whether she keeps the child or puts the child up for adoption. But she was going through this absolute dreadful turmoil, and she had no support from her family because they refused to support her in an abortion. So to cut a long story short, this young lady ended up having an abortion, and she got disfellowshipped. And it was tragic. It was really, really tragic, and it really made me question this whole belief of life is sacred, because whilst they refused to support this young woman in having an abortion, and they refused to support her through the tragedy that she'd experienced and the horrific trauma that she went through, they didn't support her around that. All they were concerned about is, we've got to keep the congregation clean, and we can't support abortion, etc., etc., etc. And it was just the worst scenario, and it really affected me and my friend as we were growing up. And we used to talk about it, because what happened was this young girl had an abortion. Her parents, she became disfellowshipped. Her parents threw her out the house, and that was the last we heard of her. She just got up and she moved away, and we never ever heard of her again. So I don't know what happened. I just hope that, you know, she was okay, and you know, she's got her life together after that. But the Jehovah's Witnesses are such hypocrites, because, you know, they refuse this young mother. They refuse to support her in an abortion, but yet on the other side of the coin, they're saying that life is sacred and must be preserved. But yet, through their policy of the blood issue, they encourage people not to take blood, and yet people are dying because of it. And in my local area in Birmingham, we had a young boy, tragic. It was massive news here in Birmingham a couple of years ago, and he was involved in a tragic car accident, and he desperately needed blood. As well, I'm only going off what the reports of that was in the news, was that he needed a blood transfusion, and his family refused, and he died. Sadly died. And then out in further afield outside of Birmingham, there was a tragic story of a young married couple. She given birth to twins, desperately needed a blood transfusion, and she refused, and again lost her life. And there were countless stories of people who've lost their lives because of the beliefs of Jehovah's Witnesses. And for me, those were two contrary things. How can you say that life is sacred and we have to preserve life, but yet through your policies encourage people not to take medical interventions that can save life? But on the other hand, where you have a tragic scenario of a young woman becoming pregnant and needing an abortion, refusing to support her and disfellowship her for it. So those were two contrary things that really, growing up as Jehovah's Witness, really just didn't sit well with me at all. And was, you know, always sat in the back of my mind. Even as a pioneer, it sat in the back of my mind as this just isn't right. It just doesn't feel right. The third area that I want to talk about that of Jehovah's Witnesses practices that just didn't sit right with me was in relation to the old mantra that they spew out about keeping the organisation clean. And again, in the congregation that I grew up with, it was all happening. It was all happening. And in the congregation that I grew up in, there was several people over the years that I was growing up and a Jehovah's Witness and going along to this Kingdom Hall. There were several people over the years that were disfellowshipped, and just a few that I remember was, we used to have a brother who had a severe alcohol problem, and he was basically an alcoholic, and he used to turn up to the meetings drunk. If it was an evening meeting, the book study, or the theocratic meeting in the week, you could guarantee this brother would be reeking of alcohol, and he literally would be staggering around the Kingdom Hall. But yet, that was absolutely fine, you know. And I don't know the internet. I don't know if he was spoken to, whatever, but there was certainly, in all the time I was going, there was no mention of this brother being reproved or disfellowshipped, nothing like that. But yeah, he clearly had a problem with alcohol. There was also a young brother he was, you know, in his mid 40s, and it became known. And the thing about the congregation, or certainly the congregation I was going to, gossip would spread like wildfire. You know, nothing was sacred. You know, you sneezed, everybody knew about it. The grapevine was alive and kicking very well. And there was a man, he was a baptized brother. He married a woman and a sister, and before long we were hearing that she'd left him because of the physical abuse that she used to suffer. And before she left him, you'd often see him at the meetings sitting there, proud as punch, hands up, answering, you know, with a roving mic, doing his ministerial duties. And then, you know, the one Sunday we didn't see his wife, we didn't see her the next meeting, and we didn't see her for a couple of meetings later. And then the news got round that she'd left him because he was beating her. He was a wife beater. Again, as far as I know, there was no mention that it was reproved or disfellowshipped, nothing like that. We also had a brother, again, a ministerial servant. I was probably about 13 or 14 at the time when the announcement was made that he had been removed from his duties as a ministerial servant. They never ever mentioned why he had been removed from his duties, but you know, by the end of the meeting, we all knew, and even me as a young teenager knew, that the reason was he'd been stealing thousands of pounds out of the collection box over a period of months, and it came to light. So we had in our congregation this pool, this, you know, pool of people who were, as I say, protected. They were protected as the drunks, the women beater, the thieves, you know, all protected. And what didn't sit well with me was that you could have these paedophiles, and we know now that paedophilia is huge amongst the Jehovah's Witnesses. And you can have this scenario where you have all of these people committing all these crimes and being protected and not reported. And they say that, you know, they're following their internal structure of this judicial meeting and the judicial review and all of this nonsense. And I call it nonsense because it is nonsense. And they say that they're doing all this internally to protect Jehovah's name and to keep the congregation clean. But in doing so, young girls like the girl I've mentioned earlier who needed support was not given any support. The wife whose husband was beating her, she had to flee and wasn't given any support. And you know, we had elders' wives. Is one elder's wife, I won't mention their name, but you know, she lived a life of misery, and I used to go out in ministry with her because I was a full-time pioneer. I used to go out in the ministry with her, and she would often be telling me how her husband, who's an elder, was leading this double life, and the hypocrisy that she saw with him. It was, you know, it really shook her faith. And there were all of this stuff going on, but yet, you know, they're protecting these criminals, and let's call it what it is. They're protecting these criminals in order to keep the congregation clean, to keep Jehovah's name clean. It's not a place that I could continue because I didn't feel safe. Young children are not safe. Women are definitely not safe along with their young children. They're not safe. but yet they do this and they say that their judicial practices or whatever ridiculous laws they and practices they want to follow, they're doing it to keep the congregation clean. It just didn't sit well with me. And those really are the three key areas that really got me thinking. It wasn't even from a scriptural point of view. For me, it was just about their practices. And another thing, which I will cover in another video, is the level of fear that, you know, I lived with, and the guilt that they put on you in order to stay in the organisation. And I, you know, being who I am, I couldn't live with that anymore and needed to break free. But those, for this video, were the three key things that really got me questioning, which is about, you know, God speaking to the organisation, their preservation of life, and their hypocrisy in terms of the blood issue, and their belief in keeping the congregation clean, but yet it's just filled. You know, it reminds me of, you know, that old saying where, you know, you keep the outside of the pot shiny and sparkly and clean, but yet inside it's filled with rotten things. And that's how the organisation comes across. And, you know, on the outside, oh yeah, let's keep the public image great, you know, the PR, you know, we need to keep great, but inside it's filled with rottenness. Yes, so if you're watching this and you can identify with me, and yeah, I'm sure you'll recognize some of the things that I'm saying, but you know, if you are thinking of leaving, then think carefully, really think carefully. There's a great community of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses on social media who's doing some fantastic work in exposing the Jehovah's Witnesses lies, their doctrines, and really making a difference to helping people wake up. And if you've never been a Jehovah's Witness, then, you know, again, watch people's videos on the in the community on social media, and just be really careful and aware of what, you know, of who they are and what they're about. I really believe that most Jehovah's Witnesses are good people. They are just completely indoctrinated, like I was, and really quite blinded to what's going on in the organisation, and they are just completely deceived. And as a community of people who've managed to escape and leave the Jehovah's Witnesses, whatever we can do to help raise awareness and help people wake up is fantastic. I woke up, although I left Jehovah's Witnesses over 30 years ago, I didn't fully really wake up until I found the ex-Jehovah's Witness community and started watching their videos and reading their materials, and that really helped me to advance my waking up and helped to advance my decoding. So, you know, they're doing a fantastic job, so thank you to everybody who takes the time to make videos. There is life after being a Jehovah's Witness, and there is a whole community out there who is ready to support and help you. So guys, thank you for watching my video. Please like and subscribe to my channel, and watch out for the next video. I'll see you soon. Bye.